My name's Patrick O'Lunig. That's our studio, nDreams. We're based in the UK. We currently have 50 people, and we're working just on VR. We've so far launched 6 VR games, and we have another 5 or 6 in development. We also work with external developers, so we're looking to find developers that we can publish and work with as well. And we've worked across a mix of mobile VR on the Gear VR and the Google Daydream, and slightly more of our titles have been on Oculus Rift, HTC Vive, and PlayStation VR. So if you take one thing away today, and you only remember one thing from what I say, I think the key message I would give you is try and design games that are only possible in VR. We've seen so many titles that would work on a typical PC or console, but are better in VR. They're cool because you feel like you're there, you look around, but they don't make use of what makes VR so special. And for me, that is the touch controls, reaching out and grabbing stuff, interacting with the world, and it's using the positional tracking to look in. You've got a great diorama to be able to peer in and have a look. There's so many great things that VR does. And if you want to make a standout VR game, you want a VR game that will be truly special, you need to make sure your design is only possible in VR. You're really designing to highlight the strengths of VR. VR has got to add something new and exciting to your design. So let me talk through a few of the common mistakes that we have made and we've seen other people make over the last few years as we've been doing VR. I think number one is don't turn things up to 11. Traditional game design is all about turning things up to 11, doing things that are full on and crazy. You look at most console games and you're backflipping onto a plane with a grappling hook, you're turning around incredibly fast, shooting lots of people. And all of that stuff is great on a television. But when you're in VR and you're there, your turning speed, what you do needs to feel comfortable. It needs to feel like what it would be like in real life because you are feeling like you're there. So things like turning around, that's probably the quickest I could comfortably move. If I walk or run, I want to walk at a speed that I'm used to. I don't want to backflip onto a plane because if I backflipped onto a plane in real life, it would feel pretty horrible, and the same is true in VR. So don't make things crazy, make things feel real, and I think that's one of the most important lessons of game design we've found. You've got to be careful about what you do with the camera. I mean, this is a really obvious one, but as soon as you start playing around with the camera, particularly when the camera isn't under player direction, when the camera moves without the player expecting it, that's when people feel really uncomfortable in VR. So think carefully about how you use cameras. Doesn't mean you have to have a static camera or the camera has to be player controlled, but you need to be very sensible about what you do with the camera. And that really is down to experimentation and trying things out, but be very, very careful with camera control. A really good tip, I think, for a VR developer is to focus on the frame rate right from day one. Too many game developers traditionally worry about frame rate later on. They get their game running, well enough, and they optimize it later. In VR, that's horrible. It makes it really hard to do user testing. It makes it really hard to get people playing the game and see how it is. So you have to think about frame rate from day one. That has to be a priority all the way through development. You can't leave it to the end. And that's definitely something I would recommend. Breaking immersion. One of the wonders of VR is that feeling you get where you really believe you're there. I remember 3 years ago, Chet actually was kind enough to give me a demo of the early Vive system, and I was sat there looking down at this plank, and there was a bottomless pit underneath me. And I think Chet said to me, "Step to your left off this plank of wood," and you go, "No, I don't want to do that. That's horrible. I'm going to die." And he said, "You're in a room. You're in a room. You've got a carpet. You've got walls around you," and you're like, "I can't do it." Everything is telling you that you can't step off this piece of wood because you will fall. And that's immersion, and that's a really powerful feeling. And you have to be very careful not to break that immersion. And I think things like poor interfaces or fake objects, you expect you're going to throw this thing and it will behave like the real world, and it doesn't. Or unrealistic audio, or what you see if you move and the view doesn't move, or any disconnect between your body and what you're seeing, that can really break the immersion, and you have to be very, very careful about that. So definitely something to be aware of. So let me talk through a few tips and tricks as well that might be useful. UI is very difficult in VR. You can't just draw in front of everything like you do on a television. There is no in front. In front is on your eyeballs, which is horrible. So where do you put UI? And what happens if you can't put it in the corner like you normally do, because if you turn your head, where the corner moves. So you have to think very carefully about UI and how you display information. If it's all possible, aim for no noticeable UI. You can do things through audio, rather than having a health bar, have the sounds, have your character grunt, have your animation and the sounds make you realize how that you're low on health, that you need to, to get a health pack or whatever. Try and do stuff using binaural audio. Try and use stuff doing 3D objects in the environment, your watch, a screen that you interact with, rather than having UI on the screen. UI is horrible in VR, I think. Movement's really tough in VR, but there have been some great examples of how to do it. We're still learning. I don't think there's any magic bullet at the moment. Love what Budget Cuts did. The mechanism of teleporting works really well. In the assembly, we have a sort of Blink VR, Blink teleport that allows you to move very quickly through an environment. It's not a teleport. It's a very fast movement in less than a quarter of a second. And it's so quick that you don't feel ill, but it's because you have actually moved, you feel like you're still within the environment. It's less disconnecting. But there's lots of nice examples. As was said earlier, you should try lots and lots of VR games and see how they deal with movement, because it's one of the hardest things to do. Obviously, if you have a room scale VR around you, that's beautiful. You can use real movement. But if you want to move through big environments, play around. Everybody's experimenting, and there's some really nice solutions out there. You just have to have a look. Smart VR storytelling. So one of the things, we'll talk about this, I think, this afternoon as a panel on storytelling, but you can use the environment to tell stories in ways that are very hard in traditional games. If you're running through a game on a typical TV screen game, quite often you don't stop to look at the environment. You don't notice things around and below you. You can't stick your head in and look underneath things. So when we've created story games, use the environment to tell the story. So we have little pieces of paper and notes and things hidden around and all sorts of cool things that tell you the story without it being too obvious. You don't want to use text. You don't want to use subtitles. We try and use what VR gives you, which is a beautiful environment that's much more interesting to interact with and notice and look at, but also audio. So you can use 3D audio. You can have the sound of water dripping down behind the walls that gives you a feeling of what's going on over there. You can use 3D audio to tell story. And I think that's something that works really well. Think about how you can use the advantages of VR to tell story in slightly different ways using 3D audio and things like that. I think the single most important thing, as was mentioned, is controls. You have to use touch controls in a clever way. It's such an amazingly key part of the VR experience. When you put a headset on, anyone for the first time, they just reach out to grab stuff. It's natural. And so I think we certainly found the Move controllers, Oculus Touch controllers, the Vive controllers, but also the Daydream controller does quite a good job of this as well, of actually allowing you to interact and feel, and makes it very intuitive. So think carefully about how you use the controls and try and make sure you do use the controls. Gamepad games can work in VR, but they're not magical. There's something that's not so great about them. Using touch controls is truly the way to go, definitely. A nice thing is that it doesn't need to be realistic to be believable. A lot of people believe that, when they first heard about VR, it's all about stimulating the real world, making you feel like you're actually in the real world, and that's not true. You can make beautiful cartoon environments. You can make environments like Tron, and although as long as you're in there, and as long as it's consistent, this is the key, it has to be consistent, you can completely feel immersed in there and you can be very happy. So the world can be cel-shaded, it can be cartoony, it can be blocky, it could be Minecraft, it could be anything, as long as it's consistent. So don't feel like it has to be photorealistic, because that's expensive, that's challenging to do. You can pick your own art style, you can be very unique, just be consistent all the way through the game to keep that immersion there. And that will feel fine. And players are very happy losing themselves in fantasy worlds that don't look real. There are so many niches in VR as well. So, one of the nice things as a developer is you don't have to make a game for everybody. You can pick a niche and be great at it. VR is growing very quickly. So if you want to be the best VR golf game developer in the world and you want to make the perfect VR golf game, do that and become the best developer at it. Think about niches. You're already seeing developers specializing in puzzle games or specializing in story-based games. And I think you can pick a niche and become very, very good and understand how to make the best game in that area in VR. There's a great opportunity to make money as VR grows. So at the moment, there are millions of niches. There are so many cool things you could do with VR. If you do a brainstorm on where VR is going, there are hundreds and thousands of ideas out there. So pick something that you love, that you have a passion for, and become really good at it. Don't think you have to make a game that appeals to everybody. And I think the single most important thing is to experiment. None of us knows everything about VR. None of us knows a lot about VR. We're all learning. This is really, really early. So you have to experiment. I think as was mentioned earlier, doing game jams, doing game hacks, messing around, trying ideas out, that's the single most important thing you can do. Quite often, we find that things that we think will work in VR don't. And things that we think, oh, that'll be horrible in VR, actually work really well. So I'll give you an example. We did a skydiving game where you're skydiving down from a high up down to the ground, and you hit the ground and you die, and you dodge things on the way. And we thought, well, would trampolines work? And would picking objects up like little gold balls, collecting them as you go down work? And we thought, well, collecting things would be easy. Every game does collection. Collecting something's dead simple. That'll definitely work. But trampolines, hitting a trampoline, oh, that's going to be horrible in VR. I'm going to feel really sick. But actually, collecting things, because you're seeing through your eyes, it's like you're hitting something physical with your head. It's horrible. Your head, if you come up to something really fast, you want to avoid it. You don't want to collect it with your eyes. That's so unnatural. So actually collecting things was really horrible and really unnatural. But actually the trampoline, because it was so quick and you would instantly go back up again, and you knew what was happening and you expected to go back up, actually it worked really well and people didn't find that uncomfortable at all. And that was very counterintuitive. We didn't expect that. And it was only by experimenting that we found that that was the case. And I think, a lot of the guys earlier, sort of talks about some of the things that they didn't expect. And I think that's really key. So try stuff out. You've got to test something. Even if you think it's obvious, test it out and see how it reacts and see how people find it. And I think lastly, I just wanted to give you 10 examples of great games for me that you all ought to play. I think, as was mentioned earlier, the best way to understand VR is to play a load of stuff and see what people are doing. No one's perfect. There is no single perfect killer VR game yet, I don't think. But there are a lot of games out there that do VR very well and do some bits very well. So for me, the 10 games up there are 10 of the most interesting titles out there and stuff that you should have a look at. In fact, the one I haven't put on there, which I think would be good, you should also have a look at is London Heist on PlayStation VR, just because of the character interaction. The one thing in that works well is the feeling of being close to an AI character, of being intimidated by him, of picking a phone up him and taking a phone off him and holding it in your hand. That kind of interaction between you and an AI character is very, very powerful as well. But all of these are great, great games that demonstrate, I think, how well VR can work. Eagle Flight's very interesting. The guys yesterday from Ubisoft did a talk here. And again, it's a great example of how you can fly freely around a great big environment, and actually it feels comfortable. And you wouldn't assume you could do that in VR, and they've done it very, very well. So if you do anything else, have a look at these examples. But I'll leave you just with the one point that I made at the beginning, which is that do something that only works in VR. Do something that makes sense only in VR, something that uses VR, uses touch controls, uses positional tracking to do something you couldn't do otherwise. That is how you're going to make a great game in VR. And if you start your design brainstorm off with that as a starting point, you're going to be in for a great opportunity. So that's it. Nice, short and sweet. If anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to answer a few questions for a few minutes.
Your last point, though, I completely agree with the wisdom of doing things that only work in VR. There are a lot of companies I hear from, though, that are nervous about our trial of disillusionment coming up in the next year and a half, and I've had people kind of pleading, saying, well, don't you think there are some things that we could do that would be a good game in non-VR but really spectacular in VR, so that we can make some money now on the regular PC or mobile version of it? And I haven't had a great answer for them. I just wanted to sort of push back on that a little bit and wonder if you found anything that maybe can cross over like that.
No, that makes sense. And although I say you should only design for VR, actually some of the games we've launched have had non-VR versions as well. And maybe that's one of the reasons I'm saying it. I think as long as the game is designed for the start from VR and uses touch controls in a really clever way, if you can then think of a way to spin that game design back to non-VR, remove the touch controls, maybe make it a little bit different, but it still works, it's still a decent game, then go for it. I think that, absolutely, why not?
So VR first, but not necessarily VR only.
I think you have to come from that view. If you come as a non-VR game and then try and VRify it, you're going to struggle. I'm only saying this to be the best VR game. It might be you're very happy to do medium VR sales, an okay VR game, and make lots of money non-VR, and that's a commercial reality, and that's fine. I'm not saying everybody has to aim to do the best VR game, but I think to make a great VR game, you've got to start with that and then maybe work back to non-VR and see if it makes sense outside of it. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your experience. Regarding previous thought, what do you think about designing games for example, Daydream and Vive Oculus? Is it okay to design for all three platforms, or should we start, for example, with Vive,
Yeah.
and after that transfer to Daydream, or?
So we're developing different games for the two. We see it as split very differently between high-end VR and mobile VR. And I think that's because, one, there's a big technical difference of how much you can draw and what you can do on screen, the number of polygons and draw counts and those things. But also, it's to do with the key stuff, the control system and positional tracking as well. You know, when we design now for high-end VR, we're trying to make sure everything uses touch controls. Everything uses the fact that you can gaze in and look around and feel like you're there. And if you don't have positional tracking on mobile, which we don't yet, I think it's coming. I think a lot of the middleware guys have announced with their mobile chips that they can support positional tracking, and that will be fantastic. But that's not there yet, and that's really key. And also, touch control is so key for high-end VR, and it's just not there. On Gear VR, you know, you're either using a controller or using the side. With Daydream, the controller's pretty cool, actually. It's a big step in the right direction. Not perfect, but you can absolutely, you know, do some really cool movements and use it as a laser pointer really nicely and rotate the world, and it helps a lot. But I still think that we're not quite there for mobile VR. I hope we'll get to a point where it registers your hands and there's no trackers. You got the headset on, it'll just tell where your hand's in, and that will be fantastic. You can grasp stuff and move it in. I hope that's where we get to. When that happens, I think you can design for both. And I think you'll see the technology side of it get better and better and better over the next couple of years. You know, this is all the headsets here today, including the Vive and the Oculus, are just version 1. You know, this is not where VR is going to end up. This is just the start point. We're like the brick smartphones. If you remember the very first cell phones, these great big heavy things that were huge, and now look at the latest iPhone or the Google Pixel. You know, they're great phones. And I think VR is like that. We are just at stage 1. And if you see the headsets that are going to come over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, 10 years, possibly see AR and VR converge into one device, it's going to be so exciting. So at the moment, no, I personally would recommend doing mobile VR game or a high-end VR game. I think it's very hard to bridge the gap, but I think you'll see that gap getting lower and lower over the next few years. Thank you very much. Cheers.